you would be pretty excited because on OG side it was ridiculously loud. Spoilers, 2-1 for OG, and they are moving into the grand finals versus Team Secret. With me, I have the man when it comes to statistics and maybe also probabilities. Nahaz, I do want to get your thoughts. Are you surprised? What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I had really liked both OG and Team Secret. Shortly after TI, I was asked sort of which of the new teams I thought had the most potential. I thought that Kuro's team would be good right away. I thought that OG would be good right away. I actually thought that Secret would be very good, but it would take some time. I didn't think they would be this good this quickly, but yeah, I mean, they look like world beaters, and OG obviously, the Cinderella story, you have to say, of this tournament, starting off in the lower bracket and making the run that they've had.
Absolutely, and the team fights and just the way that the games were choreographed looked ridiculous. Is there any certain one player on OG side that springs to mind whose performance has just amazed you throughout?
Well, I've said all along that I feel that Crit is my MVP of the tournament. We don't have good enough stats in many ways to quantify the impact of support players, but I think we've seen just amazing plays from the 4 position in particular throughout this tournament. I think it's been a theme of a lot of these series, and Crit has I don't think he's had a bad game in the tournament. To me, he has delivered. He's made game-changing plays each and every single game. I think in game 2 in particular, he had 2 of the best ice shards I've ever seen. And I thought that if he had not made those 2 big saves in the early game with ice shards, that EG might have taken the series 2-0. He had a number of course, great snowball saves. He carried a game the other day with AA Blast as a Rubik. So to me, he's really made the plays. Moon, of course, has been the player that I think everybody on the world stage after this tournament is going to be looking at as, wow, this guy is just so much better than we thought. And I mean, we've heard his story extensively from other sources about how he came from Han. He was a little bit of an out there kind of guy, but has really shifted into serious mode in these last few months and has just become one hell of a player.
All right, since you're also a professor in your off time, I think this would be a good point to kind of come with a follow-up question in regards to your statement saying that it is hard to quantify the impact that the position 4 support has on the game. I mean, you hinted on one thing, an ice shard, preventing a kill from happening is hard to kind of see in stats. Is there any other things that spontaneously come to mind when it comes to that problem of quantifying effectiveness of supports?
Well, I think that this may not answer exactly the question that you've asked, but I think the direction where you have to go is to emulate what's been done in other sports. And the big thing that I think we can do very soon, and we'll have this up and running, is a version of what the NBA does in using adjusted plus minus. Basically, you look at the fights that a player was not a part of, and you look at the difference between the engagements in which they participated and the engagements they didn't. And then there's a way that you have to scale that. You use a regression scaling of that to adjust for the fact that, of course, a team that's ahead and winning a lot of games is going to win all the team fights anyway, right? So you have to adjust for that somehow. But I think there's some meaningful progress that we can make just in some preliminary analysis. For example, you do that for TI5, and Universe ends up being the leader in that category in adjusted plus minus. So it very much sort of confirms a lot of the things that your eyes see, and that's something that you have to do with supports, because I've played around with a couple different metrics. One of the things that I used to look at was, for example, kills plus assists per 1,000 gold earned, just as a measure of production per resources used by a particular hero. And like No Tail was always the guy back when he used to play for support for Fnatic, was always ahead in that by like a mile. But at the same time, that would unfairly penalize players like AUI, who played very good supports, but were asked to farm by their team. That was part of the style of their team, that they were farming instead of getting kills in the early game. And I don't think that it makes sense to penalize a player because they're being asked to play in a particular style. So that's kind of the challenge that you face with these sorts of statistics.
So is it going to be the job of an experienced statistician such as yourself to kind of weigh it, to also include the knowledge that AUI will, of course, when you use that metric, come off worse than a no-tail?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the thing that that we've learned, again, I think we can learn a lot from other sports, right? I talked about how I think that one way you can proceed is to emulate the NBA. I think the other thing that you can do is think about the way that baseball does their statistics. And one of the big things that we learned from Bill James all those years ago was that you convert everything into win probability. Everything that happens on the field, everything that happens on the Dota 2 map has an impact on the team's win probability. And the nice thing about thinking of things in those terms is that naturally you understand that there are different ways that a team can win a game. There are different ways, gold, experience, towers, even map control itself. There are different ways that a lead can be accumulated that will eventually lead to a team winning a game. And I think when you focus on just mapping everything into win conditions, as we've seen historically from observing matches, not only endgame statistics, but full replay parsing, being able to see exactly where every hero was on the map at exactly every point, I think that is where you start being able to create statistics that will value players independently or as independently as possible from their team's playstyle.
Maybe also hero picks in regards to the enemy's hero picks will also be a good one to look at with Team Secret, for example. Like Huskar comes out in certain conditions, then your chances increase.
I mean, that's been, of course, I'm heavily biased. I'm a draft junkie, but that's been, to me, the most exciting part of this tournament is that I feel like the drafting in this tournament has been a level above even at TI5. TI5 was very exciting because we saw heroes like the Darkseer and the Templar Assassin that had been out of the metagame for some time just come roaring back and have this huge impact on these incredibly high-profile games. In this tournament, there's not necessarily, obviously, you referred to the Huskar, but there's not necessarily been one or two heroes that have come back and been picked and banned in every game just out of the blue, right? Rather, what we've seen is old configurations of heroes employed in new ways. You know, you saw the Tinker come back in EG for Game 2 in EG, which I really thought that EG should have won, if not for a lot of mid-game mistakes. And of course, you've seen the position 5. You know, the Huskar obviously is significant, but equally significant is Pile-I-Die's position 5 Tiny. Like, who does that, right? But we're seeing a level of play now where these players have so much ability and there's so much fine-tuned execution with different lineups that the draft really even means even more. And it's a strange thing because people think about, well, you can win the draft, but if you out-execute, you can lose the draft, but if you out-execute, you still win. They think about sort of there being a substitutability between winning the draft and execution in the game. I think there's actually a complementarity because if you know how all 5 of your players play and you have 5 incredibly flexible and talented players, you can make strats work that other teams can't. And that's what I think you're seeing win in this tournament. That's what excites me so much about Dota right now.
Let's switch gears a bit and talk about EG and the fact that they just lost 2-1 versus OG. Were you impressed with the way they played? I mean, obviously OG performed extremely well. What were some of the, I mean, you just mentioned a few flaws in Game 2. Would you see most of the reasons for their loss, sources for mistakes in draft or gameplay? And maybe expand on your ideas there a little bit?
I think the panel talked about this yesterday, and we've been talking about this off camera a lot, that I think there's been some commonality in both the way that EG lost and the way that Vici Gaming lost yesterday as well. There just have been fights that they've committed to that they didn't need to commit to, and most importantly, it's a very, very old tune, right? That one of the hardest things in Dota is understanding when to let a teammate die and when to sacrifice one hero to save 2 or 3 more. And that's where I felt, especially in the mid-game in Game 2, there were several straight engagements where EG, they fed away a couple of deaths that they didn't really need to. And one of the overarching themes in very high-level play is that mistakes are punished so heavily. It's like the NFL, right? It's a game of mistakes. It's a game of big plays, but it's a game of big plays made possible by mistakes. The big turnover, the big interception. That's what you're seeing in these games because these teams are playing at such a high level.
I think what's also interesting to think about is the fact that since EG switched rosters a bit, coming back, that maybe that's a reason, that old teamwork, maybe that leads to faulty behavior in game, where you're like, oh, that's now my buddy Arteezy in there, and maybe because you're not as maybe the roles and the communication isn't on quite the level yet that OGs is at, and maybe then you start deciding on doing things that perhaps would not be otherwise acceptable if you would just just think it through calmly.
I mean, I think it could be several things. One of the things, it doesn't necessarily have to even be communication issues during engagements, right? One of the things that you have to understand is that both Sumail and Arteezy are very resource-intensive players. They take up a lot of space on the map. They require a lot of space from teammates. Now, what they're able to do with that space is obviously incredible. There's a reason that statistically, in terms of GPM, XPM, these guys are number 1 and number 2 all time in LAN matches. But the flip side of that is, during the early game especially, and parts of the mid game, they need their team to assist them in creating that space. And when Fear was playing the position 1, he was much more active around the map, looking to make things happen, which created space for Sumail to sort of come out all of a sudden at 15 minutes with two big items on his Storm Spirit and just crush the entire enemy team. With Arteezy and Sumail, you saw, for example, again in the second game today, that you saw a Sumail Tinker that, even though they were a little bit behind, was able to just farm camps around the map. There was a point in that game that they were like 2 or 3K gold behind in the mid game, and he was still farming both the Radiant and the Dire jungle and 2 lanes. And at that point, you're like, wow, I mean, this is really, really good. This is what EG does. They're efficient in all game states, even if they're behind. But Arteezy's playing Sven. What are they going to do? How's he going to get farmed? Now, they were trying to stack Ancients for him. But of course, a team like OG knows what's going on, and that's what we've seen in the past. This is some of the criticism that has been made about Eternal Envy, is that he's very efficient around the map at gathering resources, but that efficiency can make you predictable, because if you're following these heavily optimized farming patterns, it means the other team's going to know where you're going to be. So that's the issue that I think EG have to address going forward, is how you